Well, hello everybody. Pastor Andy here. Hope you're well today on this beautiful Wednesday, wherever you are in the world. I hope you're doing great. We started yesterday talking about infancy. And while we always associate that word with babies, we also, if we start looking at it from where we are with this concept of growing in Christ, this new birth, we also begin to recognize that it is the beginning. And while beginnings are vital, obviously we have to have a beginning in order for anything to start, we can't stay there. The beginning is just that. The first chapter of the book is just that. But you got to understand the rest of the story, the first breath, the first appearance of a green stem through the dirt. It all has a beginning. It all starts, but it can't stay there. We quickly grasp that when it comes to physical things, living, breathing, growing up, whatever. We tend to say, okay, I get that. That's not a hard thing to understand at all. But we don't tend to place the same importance of that on our spiritual life because, and again, I don't say this to group everybody together or stereotype or anything like that, but we've been conditioned as time has gone on, and certainly we can point a lot of fingers as to how and why, but let's try to stay focused. We've been conditioned to be distracted. And the distractions place our intentions, our directions, and our thoughts in everywhere else. But in the one thing that can actually make our life better. We tend to chase after gimmicks. We tend to chase after quick fixes. We chase after all the different things that are placed before us because that just might be the one. That just might be the answer. That just might be that's it. That's what. All the while leaving aside the one thing that can work. The one promise that we have that is actually kept. I will never leave you or forsake you. While we're chasing those other things, that promise remains solid. And that promise remains put. It doesn't change. In order for us to grow in our spiritual life, there has to be a willingness to grow. There has to be a true desire. But then there has to be an action. In other words, it's intentional. Oftentimes, and I left off with this yesterday, we find so many becoming complacent, becoming comfortable, and again, even becoming unwilling to do anything else. As it pertains to the church world or whatever label we want to put on, I tend to say that is the prayer crowd. Please understand me. I am not denigrating saying the prayer, not at all. But as we understand words, as we understand intentions, if that is all that has ever happened, we can make the argument that that may be all that is required to accept Christ or not. And again, that could be a long debate over that. Because while the words themselves are not necessarily wrong, I accept Christ. Romans chapter, Romans wrote very, very clear. If we confess with our mouth, that could certainly be argued to be the prayer, that Jesus Christ is Lord, that that He died and rose again. If we can make that argument, and we can say, okay, that's all it says. I'm saved. Okay, we can go down to the Chevrolet place this afternoon. We can take $100,000 if you have it, or if you got enough credit to get it, and lay it on the table and drive out of there with a brand new Corvette. Bring it to your house, set it in the driveway, and put the keys on the shelf. And you can say that you own that Corvette. It's yours. Nobody's going to come take it. Nobody's going to repossess it or whatever. But never drive it. Never do one thing with it. Did it benefit your life? Other than to say, well, I got it. What did you do with it? While our relationship with Christ can't be related to a car or some type of trinket or treasure, at the same time there is an expectation that it not just be a trinket on the shelf, that it not just be a badge that we wear. I said it. I'm in. Jesus says we bring honor and joy into the Lord by bearing fruit. What are we doing with what we've got? In other words, are we growing? So saying the words, accepting this, doing that's just one part. In other words, opening a door is one part, but going through it is another part. Going through it requires taking steps. It's not just standing there and looking at it. God's plan is very clear. Very clear. It begins with birth. That's the start. That's where it all starts there. All of us start there, physically and spiritually. Two different things. Physically born unto our mothers, spiritually born unto God. So the plan begins with birth. That's the start. But then the next part is growth, the process, the living, the learning. And what does that move toward? Maturity. Birth, growth, maturity. In other words, surrender, understanding, able to show others. As I talked about in our previous set of lessons, we recognize very quickly, in fact, physical growth, because that's easy to see. It's a constant change. Every time I see my two grandsons, it's different. They're a little bit, it seems like it, they're a little bit taller, they got a little more teeth, a little more hair, whatever. Their reactions are different. They have different times that they smile and laugh, and it's a constant change. That's what we're supposed to do. That's the physical side of things. We encourage that type of change. Eat right, take your vitamins, exercise, do whatever. But how much attention, how much emphasis, if you will, is placed in the same manner? Go to the doctor, get the physical, check this, check that, all the different things that we seemingly are concerned with when it comes to our physical well-being. Do we place that same emphasis on our spiritual well-being? I think that is a vital question, because this is not about religion. This is not about which church you join. This is not about how many places you give charitable donations to. This is about the relationship between you and God. Think about that for a minute. What does that look like? If we're in a relationship with another person and we don't ever talk to each other, we don't really ever know each other. If we only communicate once a year on your birthday or on Christmas or whatever, okay, it's a nice thing to hear, but there's no relationship there. There's an acquaintance. You don't know each other. If you're married to someone and you never speak to each other, you live in the same house, you're basically glorified roommates. That's not a marriage. That's not a relationship. That's nothing. That's an existence. If we keep God, and I've said this before, in the break in case of emergency glass on the wall, but that's it. I've got everything else until something goes wrong. That's not a relationship. So how are we growing that? How are we getting there? How many remain in infancy? And this is going to be our focus today. I want us to think about that. If you think about that innocent little person that you've held in your hands, maybe your son or daughter, maybe your grandson or granddaughter, maybe a nephew, or maybe just some friend's child. But at some point in time, we've all experienced that little person. Maybe you've never experienced that, but you held a puppy. Regardless, a little life was in your hands. While cute and sweet and innocent, we can't process that they would stay that way, because that's not normal. We can't fathom the idea that every day that's what's going to be. There's nothing else. That's it. They're here, completely incapable of doing anything for themselves ever. Now, think of that from yourself. Imagine never being able to leave the crib. Always dependent on someone else to feed you. Never being able to be out of diaper. Having to eat strained peas every day. I mean, we can't imagine that. We can't process that type of thinking because it's not normal. In rare, minor cases, very rare, but let's just say it is possible that someone does do that and they never develop and they stay in that state. It's not a good thing. And I don't say that to be, again, demeaning toward that unfortunate situation. But in general, we can't process what that would be like to never have the ability to grow up, to never have the ability to think for ourselves, move and drive and work and all the different things. We can't. Now, on the spiritual side, though, we don't seem to be concerned about that. Well, Pastor, why does this matter? Because your soul matters. Friends, this life that we're in is just one part. This is not eternity. This is not about, well, I'll live for X amount of years and then I'll just be gone and it won't matter. That's not true. There's something more. How are we preparing for that? What are we doing to prepare our hearts and our souls for that meeting that is assigned, that is appointed for once unto man, it is appointed to die, and then the judgment. What have we done to prepare for that? What are we doing to grow ourselves, which ultimately help us grow others? We train and we learn a particular thing, a sport or a business thing or whatever the case. Do we pass that on? How to make a cake, how to do it. We pass those things on. How to build something. We pass that on. Our spiritual legacy, our spiritual things that we pass on are equally as important, if not more. What are we doing? What are we doing to grow? We can't imagine being in the crib forever. We can't imagine from a physical, mental, every other, we can't imagine that. But however, we go back to the spiritual side of things and we say the prayer, join the church, memorize John 3:16. We're done. I've got enough. I have done everything I need to do. Now, granted, that doesn't apply to everybody. But Paul, in this letter that we're reading, he recognized what happens when growth is not a concern. And when that becomes the issue, it becomes a problem. Why? Why does it become a problem? Because there's no example being set. Think about that for a minute. If no one rises above, if no one learns more, if no one becomes exemplary at what they do, nobody else learns either, because no one else tries. No one else has an example to follow. I've talked about this before, and if we look at the book of Revelation, we understand why it begins with a rebuke. That's what it is. But it's not just a rebuke of just anyone. It is not just a chastisement, if you will, of just anyone. No, it is clearly directed in one direction, and that is to the church. Now, what church? Whose church? God's church, which is His people. It is not a building. It is certainly not a denomination. It is those who have come to know Him, those who have come to embrace Him, those who have come to accept Him for who He is. And He tells them, you've got several parts of that right, but there's a whole lot of it you didn't. It wasn't about being judgmental. It wasn't about being even, fussing or finger pointing. It was about, why? Do you not understand that if you're not doing this part right, you're affecting that part? And if you don't put those two things together and correct that, how can you possibly expect for anybody else to ever learn? Does that make sense? We find within the confines of the church world the complaining and negativity toward the world. Oh, they do this and they do that, and they make all these, horrible decisions, and they live these immoral lives. But is there an example being set that says there's something different? We can make a strong argument in all kinds of areas of that conversation. Again, we can compare divorce rates, they're on par. We can compare adultery, they're on par. We can compare bothering children, they're on par. And that horrible list could just go on and on and on. And that is not to denigrate the institution of the church. But Jesus is saying, wait a minute, if you're not growing, as we said from our study in 1 Peter, in the grace and the knowledge of Christ, and as Paul says here, wait a minute, I'm not able to even talk to you right now in the manner which I need to because you're still a baby. What? Why? You've been given everything. You've been given every nutrient. You've been given everything that you need. Why are you still there? You're not setting an example because you're not trying to be one. You're not growing at all. What is going on? In the letters to the church, Jesus begins with the root, if you will, of the problem. When He says to the church at Ephesus, you've done this right and you've done that right, but this I have against you. You have left your first love. What should be the first love of the church? Christ. Because without Him, we don't exist. Literally, physically, spiritually, every other kind of way. Nothing was created. John chapter 1, nothing was created that He didn't create. He's saying, where am I at in this? You've become so busy with doing your charitable deeds, and you're doing this and you're doing that, and you're building your reputation, and you're marketing your brand, and you've got your shirts and your hats and your big name on the wall, and but where am I at? I'm no longer a part of that. And if so, it's in name only. You're no longer in love with me. Because if you love me, you'll spend time with me. If you love me, you want to grow in me. And so this I have against you. You've left your first love. Now left is the pivotal word in this, because leaving is a voluntary action. If I get up from this chair and I walk out of this room, I left this room on my own accord. I did that. I made that choice. Leaving our first love, if we look at that from a relational standpoint, humanity standpoint, if we're with someone and we leave, we did that. We're no longer with them. But he says, this I have against you. You've done that. You've left your first love. And if you don't come back, there's a consequence. That was not a threat. That was saying, if you don't come back to your core, to your root, you can't grow. And if you don't grow, then you're of no effect. And if you're not going to be of an effect, then I'm going to remove your ability to be effective. I'm going to take your golden candlestick and I'm going to put it somewhere where it will. Remember, Jesus said, if you don't praise me, the rocks will. Creation will praise God. Creation will honor God. You hear it every morning when the birds sing, when the sun comes up, when the dew is on the ground. Creation praises God. Paul is saying here, if we're not growing, and if it's not a concern, it becomes a problem. Because it begins to not just affect you, it begins to affect those around you. It's like if you're the core of your family, the provider, and you don't do that, eventually it's not just you that's hungry, it's those around you. Our spiritual life, friends, does not get the attention that it should. And I'm not talking about having to be in the Bible 24 hours a day. I'm not talking about only watching Billy Graham on TV or Charles Stanley. I'm not talking about that. What is our relational status with Christ? Does he have preeminence? Is he number one? Because that's where it all starts. It's a growing pattern. We take our first breath in order to live. That's how the growing process starts. Coming to know Christ, accepting Christ, that's just the first part. What are we doing with things beyond that? How do we recognize, how do we see spiritual infancy? We'll talk about that tomorrow. God bless you. I hope you have a great day.